Okay, welcome back, everybody. Um, all right, so far, ever since we started our distance learning, we've been able to take the opportunity to talk about the Richard Nixon presidency, his domestic policy, his foreign policy, and namely how his presidency came to an end through the Watergate scandal. And that only makes sense that our next stop um, in the 70s, with mid to late 70s, is discuss the Ford and Carter presidencies, but we're not going to go there just yet. We're going to take a bit of a detour, and in this particular segment, it's going to serve as a primer, if you will. A primer introduction to a particular part of the world, U.S. foreign policy, um, as it is aimed towards this particular world. And, well, let's just start with this springboard statement. As Richard Nixon, on the advice of Henry Kissinger, embraced détente. And there was a number of reasons for this happening. Okay, the economic situation, to a great extent, demanded a change in approach and attitude towards the Soviet Union. This is ultimately true to a great extent. Um, Prior to that, and even after that, we need to start paying attention to as the Soviet threat. It doesn't fade away, but as it becomes less existential, less ominous, at least during the 1970s. The nukes are still there. MAD is still there. Um, Another part of the world is going to start to become of greater and greater long-term overall global security concern, particularly to the United States. Resources play a large role in this. This is a very resource-rich part of the world, namely oil. And to understand where we are now and how this part of the world occupies such a dominant position in this country's, view of the world and foreign policy, you know, hot spots, if you will, throughout the world. I think it'd be worthwhile that we take a little bit of time to discuss how it came to be. How did well, let's just, go to the next slide. How did this part of the world, the part of the world that is referred to as the Middle East or the Near East, come to eventually come to be a lightning rod, if you will, a place of incredible importance for the United States when it came to foreign policy. And as the Soviet threat diminishes and over time disappears, um, it ends up taking front and center to this day. Why this part of the world, and why, you know, yeah, why the great interest? Well, resources were a part of this. Let's not lie. It's the most oil-rich part of the world, and so many things that we could discuss. I actually made a PowerPoint before this, a presentation before this, and I had to cut it down because we went into um, really into overtime. Let's first start with this statement, and we're going to go back to it a little bit later. This part of the world, um, there's a lot of history here. This is the birthplace of civilization, by the way. This is where civilization, the way we want to define it, was born. This is the birthplace of the three major religions of the Western world. Four, if you want to count Zoroastrianism, that actually predates um, Judaism. Um, and then in particular, if you look at the geography of this part of the world as it exists today, that deserves a lot of mention also. Because those borders, the geography of that part of the world is a product of a conflict that occurred over 100 years ago. And outsiders drawing the lines and creating the modern day states of what today is Egypt and Iraq and Jordan and Syria and Turkey and Iran and Oman and Yemen, etc., etc. And most of these borders did not exist over 100 years ago. Now, if I were to ask you in class, all right, so what drew the United States into this part of the world? What's the event that draws the United States into this part of the world? Um, and it's slow coming. It's a gradual process. By no means am I the ultimate expert on this, and I am going to post videos of others that perhaps you want to take into consideration as well. This is a very controversial subject. This is one of those minefields that I do not have the luxury of avoiding because of the nature of my particular profession. Try to be as objective as possible. And I think most people would agree it boils down to this. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has been brewing since 1947 in the Levant, within the borders of some say Israel, some say Palestine. Nonetheless, that is the spark, if you will, that has led to almost 50 years, well, almost 70 years of crisis and turmoil, much of which has sucked the United States into that part of the world because of the global role that the United States plays. And a lot of it boils down to this particular conflict. So let's talk about this. Over the course of thousands of years, that being the oldest part of the world, civilization was born, there's been a number of people that have come and gone. Borders have danced all over that map. But let's look at what's happening in the mid to late 60s. And maybe remember my lecture from last year. We talked about World War One, and there's also you probably get a lot more of this in world history. The emergence of nationalism, the nation state, as defined by a common people with common borders, common language, common culture, common historical experience, yada yada yada, and the concept of a nation state emerging and replacing the idea of a monarchy being the glue that holds society, this idea that a nation and how we define nation, and quite often it is ethnic and racial, it is what defines this. And nationalism, was a fever, okay? It justified imperial conquest. Here in the United States, we always had a challenge defining what American nationalism is really about, what gives it shape, and quite often, it boiled down to racial descriptors, like it or not. In France, it was easier. Spain was easier. And it's not just big established nation states that caught the nationalism fever. Remember, nationalism was one of the causes of World War One, but smaller, even nationless peoples began to subscribe and actually promote the idea that they should have nations of their own, that people who may not necessarily have, defined borders, nation of their own, a piece of land of their own, but they share so many of these things in common, they should have a nation of their own. And out of this emerging trend, and it's helped on by a number of factors, emerges the Zionist movement. The father of the Zionist movement was a man named Theodore Herzl, 1860 to 1906. A couple of things that, that are influencing him. Number one, yes, the rising tide of nationalism in the world. Number two, anti-Semitism, as it historically been practiced in Europe towards people of the Jewish faith. And number three, well, the Dreyfus Affair as it happened in France. But number three, those two things combined, a willingness to promote the idea that maybe the Jews of Europe should be allowed to go back to their biblical homeland and reestablish a new nation, a new homeland for the Jewish people. Since, anti-Semitism was not a very welcoming trend. Um, so let's talk a bit about the historical claim to this. So here we have a map at some point in the past of historical Israel and Judea, the promised land of the Jewish people. So let me see if I can condense this real quickly. Judaism was born almost 6,000 years ago in what we call today Mesopotamia, Iraq. It distinguished itself from its surrounding neighbors by developing a monotheistic faith. Unlike all the other faiths around them that were polytheistic, they developed a monotheistic faith and a literature to go along with it. They claimed that there was only one God, and that was the God of the Jewish people, and the Jews were God's favored people. And God had great plans for the Jewish people, but they had to follow his laws. Okay, the Bible and the Old Testament actually, in its attempt to describe historical events, they were driven out of Babylonia. They end up in what is today, I guess we would call Israel. Lots of conflict with their neighbors. Eventually, they lose a war with the Egyptians. They're taken into Egypt as slaves. There's a lot of dispute among modern day historians about whether that really happened. Nonetheless, Moses comes around, tells the Pharaoh, let his people go. The religious tradition tells them that God had, the reason why they were taken into slavery because they displeased God. They didn't follow his laws because they're all, they have stricter rules. They're more God. Let's just say is more of a strict father with them than anybody else. And but they had done their time, and Moses delivered them. Um, and there's a land that he's promised to them. And so Joshua that survives Moses, he's told to go into the land of Canaan and slaughter every man, woman, and child, for that's the promised land of the Jewish people. And they do so, and they establish, at first I believe it was Judea, and later on Israel. It's gone back and forth. But let's fast forward. Let's fast forward to about 2,000 years ago. I guess what we could call Jewish nationalism was not necessarily a new thing in the 19th century. All of that area fell under the domain of the Roman Empire, and there were Jewish nationalists that wished to expel the Romans and to establish an independent kingdom, independent of Roman control. And even the figure that is referred to as, Jesus, the son of Joseph of Nazareth, he was also caught up in this Romans versus Jewish nationalists fighting for a homeland of their own, although he claimed that the homeland that he was trying to create was not one on this earth. Romans didn't necessarily crucify people because of religious differences. The Romans didn't do that. There were dozens and dozens of competing religions within the Roman Empire. But they did not look favorably upon separatist nationalists. Well, sometime after Jesus dies, this separatist problem continues, and then the Romans decide to clamp down on them. And the end result is they are driven out of Israel and Judea. And they basically are dispersed to other parts of the world. Those that would eventually migrate to Eastern and Central Europe, and over the next 2,000 years would be known of as the Ashkenazim Jews. And over those 2,000 years, they would intermarry and have children. Despite being a faith that tries to stay within its own circles, yes, they would intermarry and have children with the local populations. And 2,000 years later, you have, a Jewish people, but also heavily entrenched in places like Poland and Russia and Germany, but always subject to anti-Semitism, always reminded that they were the other. They had no nation. They were a nationless people. Others, fled to what would one day become Turkey and Northern Africa, even as far as Spain, even when they were under Muslim control, because for most of their history, Muslims and Jews got along perfectly fine, actually. It was, the issue, if anything, was with the Christian world. Um, and they're called the Sephardim. The Sephardim are the Jews that were expelled and ended up migrating, I guess you could say, westward towards North Africa. And then some of them stayed in the area. And some Jews stayed in the area. So I guess they would not be either Sephardim or Ashkenazim. Um, and so here comes a guy named Herzl, and he, in response to nationalism, in response to anti-Semitism, he wants to reestablish the homeland for the Jews as it existed 2,000 years ago, so that all the Jews could return back home and live together, common people, common culture, common language, common historical experience, within common borders on a common piece of land what they claim to have an ancestral right to. There's just one problem here. In the space of 2,000 years, other people have moved into that area. Okay? Either we're already in that area, may have been Jews at one time, and then converted to other faiths, mostly, namely Islam, or remain that area, but we're still Jews, and they were a very small group of people, or migrated to that area. So, I said it before, the movement that Herzl gave birth to was called the Zionist movement, the movement to reestablish a Jewish homeland in the Levant. He dies before World War I even begins, but he very much lives in the age of empire, where it's perfectly normal for European powers to claim pieces of land here and there from people that they consider to be inferior. If you remember what we spoke about World War I last year, the British made promises to the Arabs, okay, that, hey, fight on our behalf against the Ottoman Turks, and we're going to give you an independent nation. And T. Lawrence, made an alliance with Hussein bin Ali, and they waged guerrilla warfare against the Ottomans. And before the war is over, the French and the British are already making secret designs to drive a knife in the back of the Arabs and betray them. There will be no independent nation. The Sykes-Picot Treaty of 1916 is going to carve up what was once the Ottoman Empire into mandates, which is just a cute word for colony, since colony was losing its luster, if you will. And pays particular attention to the area in green. Okay? Not all of it, but an area that would fall within what would be called the mandate for British Palestine. Already there is consideration. Okay? And yes, the arguments from the Zionists have played a role in this. Already consideration about setting up a piece of land for Europe's Jews. Just a couple of years later, we get the Balfour Declaration. Now, Alfred Balfour was the Foreign Secretary during World War I of Great Britain. And he had a long-time friendship with Mr. Walter Rothschild, who was of the famous Rothschild banking family, and Jewish, and a politician, and a Zionist. He himself was very close to the leadership of, the Zionist movement, namely Chaim Weizmann. Rothschild had put money into, as early as the early 1900s, trying to encourage Jews to move to what at the time was Palestine under the Ottomans, and to reestablish settlements and communities there and try to grow the Jewish population. So here we are in World War I, and Rothschild is able to take advantage of his friendship with Balfour and push and push and push, asking Balfour to push on the British government. Since it's already been decided that the Arabs aren't going to get squat, and the British and the French are going to come in there and establish mandates, hey, do you think you could set aside a little slice for us to reestablish the homeland of the Jewish people? I mean, since you're already going to carve up this place in disregard of the Arabs that you just used against the Ottomans, can you possibly look into carving a piece out for us already? I mean, already we've been trying to move people there. Hasn't worked the first time, but that was with the Ottomans. Maybe under British rule, it'll work out better. And you're free to freeze the slide and read this letter from Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild, basically claiming that the Majesty's government was very much in favor with this idea of setting up a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. However, there is a statement about, but nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So that's going to be an issue moving forward. But already we see the Western world getting ready to carve up the Middle East and setting aside a little piece at the behest of the Zionist organization for the existence of a Jewish homeland. When Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, they sent a delegation, and the delegation presented its case before the Allies for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and it was met with approval and enthusiasm. Unlike the claim of the Arabs, who was it? One of the sons of the guy that fought alongside T.E. Lawrence. He goes to, is it Faisal? Yeah, Faisal goes to Paris and he says, listen, you guys lied to my father. We don't care. And he left home empty-handed. And if you really want to understand the roots of why the Arab world and the Western world have been at odds for such a long time, that is absolutely a point of origin. T.E. Lawrence recognized that. The fact that they were made promises and these promises were broken and they were betrayed by the British. And they didn't forget that. People have very long memories on that part of the world. So the war ends, the League of Nations is established, and with it, the League of Nations, of course, grants the British what is referred to as the British Mandate for Palestine. The French get Syria and Lebanon. The British get the Mandate for Palestine and the Mandate for Mesopotamia, which is going to become Iraq one day. And as you can see on that map on that left, it's much larger than, the borders of Palestine today, if you recognize the existence of a Palestine. It was much larger. But the fact was, the Jewish community was a small minority community in the overall British Mandate for Palestine. Now, the British realized that they hadn't done Hussein bin Ali wrong. 2 years later, they attempt to make amends for it. Not to Hussein bin Ali, but to his sons. His sons that also led troops during the war against the Turks. Okay? His son Abdullah, they take the British Mandate for Palestine and they split it down the Jordan River. Everything east of the Jordan River becomes the Emirate of Transjordan. And it becomes a British protectorate, okay, under Abdullah, who is the son of bin Ali. And then they take the British Mandate for Mesopotamia and they create the country of Iraq. And they give it to Hussein bin Ali's other son, Faisal. So they did try to make amends. They're British protectorates, but they tried to make amends and not completely rip off at least the sons of bin Ali. Bin Ali is going to end up in exile because the kingdom of Hijaz, which he was able to retain and hand over to his other sons, was overrun by the Saudis. Bin Ali did not want to sign the Treaty of Versailles. He felt he was, betrayed, and because of that, the British wouldn't support him. And then the House of Saud comes and takes the kingdom of Hijaz away from him, as well as Mecca, which is very important. So after 1922, the mandate for Palestine is significantly smaller than in 1920. And if there is to be a homeland for the Jewish people in what was once their biblical homeland, so according to their claims, it's been reduced to a much smaller piece of real estate. And again, there are people that live there. Okay, are they Jordanians? Are they Egyptians? Are they Syrians? Well, these arguments can go back and forth all day. The people that came, the Jews that came to Palestine, are they really from there? Or are they really Germans and Poles and Russians? I mean, that nastiness could be exchanged all day long. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of the population of what would end up being British Palestine in 1922 was Arab. And not just Arab Muslims, Arab Christians as well. And Arab Jews. Yes, Arab Jews. Then we have to have World War II, right? And so here's a map on the left. This is pre-World War II. If we were to compare the number of Arab settlements to Jewish settlements, it's more than obvious that Jewish settlements, were a very small minority of that part of the world. Okay? Under British mandate, it was even smaller under the Ottomans. A very small piece. Most of the entire place is mostly Arab. Jerusalem was mostly Arab. Most of the Jews were located around Tel Aviv and Jaffa. As more Jews move into the area and the British authorities do very little to stop it, and then after World War II and the Holocaust, there is an abundance of sympathy with the Jewish people. A lot of Jews don't want to go back to Europe, don't want to go back to, the very neighbors, okay, that threw their family members, maybe themselves, at the Nazis and into the camps and led to the death of, 6 million people. So you can understand why a lot of the Jews of Europe had no interest in staying in Europe after World War II. Okay? And wanted to live somewhere else. And Israel becomes a very desirable, attractive option there. And the British are not really doing much to stop them. Because why would you? These people have suffered, incredible horrors that nobody else has. But it's creating tension with the Arab communities that feel that, number one, the British are here. That was betrayal, number one. Number two, they're allowing the introduction of a new group of people that are not like us. And, eventually, if this continues, we are going to see ourselves supplanted and replaced, which is kind of true. And these people coming claim that they have a historical right to this land more than the people that already live there. It's religious in nature. What begins to develop, okay, between 46, 47, 48, is tension between Arab and Jewish communities ends up in all-out civil war. The strangest of civil war, a three-way civil war. Arabs fighting Jews, Jews fighting Arabs, Jews fighting the British authorities, Arabs fighting the British authorities fighting both Arabs and Jews. Okay? The Arabs want the Jews out and they want the British out. The Jews want the British out so they can take complete control and then do what they want with the Arabs. Okay? And the British are just trying to keep control of the situation of their own doing. Okay? They brought a group of people into a piece of land which somebody was already there, and the people that are already there feel that they're about to be supplanted. And of course, this tension becomes violent, becomes civil war. And by the time you get to 1948, a significant number of Arabs from the Palestinian area start leaving. They either flee or they're pushed out of their homes and lands by the Jewish settlers. In 1947, the United Nations attempts to create a peace, if you will, Okay, tries to create a peace, um, and offers the UN partition plan of 1947. Say, listen, we know you guys don't get along. The promises have to be kept. So let's just split up this piece. A piece of land is about the size of Tennessee. Okay. Whatever's orange, and this is way more than, than the actual Jewish population. Everything is in orange is going to go to the Jews to establish a Jewish state. Everybody gets access to the sea. And with everything in yellow, the West Bank and the Gaza, that all goes to the Arabs. Well, wouldn't you know, nobody was happy with that arrangement. Okay? Nobody was happy with that arrangement. Um, and the British pledge that they're going to leave in 1948. So everybody's nervous. The British mandate's going to end in 1948. They're going to pull out of the area. Violence, even terrorist attacks are playing a role in trying to push the British out of here as soon as possible. Okay? Yes, some of the early Zionist groups in Israel resorted to bombings of public places to push the British to get out of the area. Okay? And also terror on the Arab communities to get them to leave their homes and businesses and farms and fields and leave that for Jewish settlers to come in and take it. Um, as soon as the British leave, um, and already there's conversations in Washington about President Truman. President Truman, what do you do about this? Okay, well, are you going to support the establishment, the formal establishment of a Jewish homeland? And there's a big difference, okay? The Balfour Declaration, they all supported the idea of a Jewish homeland. But a Jewish homeland and a Jewish state are completely different, okay? The League of Nations was okay with British Palestine with a Jewish homeland, okay? Even Congress passed a resolution, a little-known resolution, supporting the idea for a national homeland. But nothing is a state with a government, okay, with an army and a navy and et cetera, et cetera. Truman has bigger fish to fry, frankly, okay? He's trying to stop the expansion of the Soviet Union into Europe, communism into East Asia, and trying to keep it from boiling over its borders into the Middle East. I mean, crying out loud, Iran has a border with the Soviet Union. He feels that the best course of action would be one that would not basically create anger, resentment, and therefore an open door for the Soviets to come in and exploit the situation and therefore expand their influence. So Truman is pretty much on the fence. He's fine with supporting the establishment of a Jewish state, okay, in Israel, but he's worried that this could ruin relations between the U.S. and the Muslim world. Because there's so much oil in that part of the world, it could restrict access to the oil, destabilize the region, cause a regional arms race, and worst of all, invite the Soviets to start playing global chess in that part of the world as well. 2 days later, on May 14th, 1948, the British Mandate ends. That very day, the Provisional Government of Israel declares its existence, the independence of Israel, and the creation of the Jewish state of Israel. Yes, a religious, Israel is one of the few countries in the world that are actually defined by faith, okay? Like your Pakistans and your Saudi Arabias, they're defined by faith. It's the country of the Jewish people. Um, like I mentioned earlier, coinciding with the British leaving and the Israelis declaring independence. This is just the second phase of that war. The first phase was the Civil War, that three-way civil war. The second phase, upon the Israelis declaring independence, their 5 Arab neighbors, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, Now that the British are leaving and they're not going to be able to protect you, invade. Okay, invade the brand new, newly declared country of Israel. Now, mind you, at this time, most of the military support that Israel was receiving was from Europe, not from the United States. The United States was playing it neutral, did not want to antagonize the Soviets, so they're doing this mostly with European assistance. Um, 5 countries attack, and 10 months later, the Arab states are delivered their first humiliation. Okay. Uh, Israel is not only able to defend and retain what 1947 partitioned described as the Jewish areas. It takes about 60% of the Arab areas as well. And the argument being that simply by winning the war, it had a right to those areas. So 10 months of fighting. It was the Arabs that attacked the Israelis first. And this is only going to further antagonize the expulsion of the Arabs from the area, particularly the area that the Israelis were able to take um, in the Israeli-Arab War, the Arab-Israeli War, or the Israeli War of Independence. So Israel is able to defend its areas, take 60% of the Arab areas, so that's the end of the 47 partition. Jordan is able to take the West Bank and keep it, and Egypt is able to take the Gaza Strip. And then also, this is the year of the Nakba. In the end, before Israeli independence and after, up to 80% of the Arabs that lived in British Palestine are going to be expelled or are going to flee. Over 600 Arab villages are going to be sacked. To this day, people still have the keys of the homes and properties that they were the owners of, that they were forced out of in this conflict. They were not part of those 5 Arab countries, but because they were Arabs, they were pushed out as the Israelis advanced. There's a little event that I have to sandwich in there so you could understand. Now, this is gonna, not only is there Jewish nationalism, but this is also going to feed the fire of Arab nationalism. And Arab nationalism at the time was very secular, very pro-modern, very secular, very modern type of nationalist. And the leader of the Arab nationalist movement was a man by the name of Nasser, who was currently the president of Egypt. He is the guy that got rid of the king of Egypt when Egypt kicked out the British and became an independent state of their own. Egypt being independent, I believe it was in 1953 or 56, you're going to have to look it up, the Suez Canal crisis. Egypt attempted to nationalize the Suez Canal. Who responded? The French, the British, and the Israelis in a coalition marched across the Sinai, okay, to attack the Egyptian army, okay? Because the Egyptian army not only was going to, the Egyptians were not only going to nationalize the Suez Canal, but they were going to deny its use to Israeli ships. The only thing that kept the British, the French, and the Israelis from marching into Egypt itself, very rare occurrence, both the United States and the Soviet Union together took Egypt's side and talked everybody into going back home. Okay? So that's a conflict that we need to sandwich in there that's not put in there. 6-Day War, 1967. The Israelis were already, tensions were never good. It's been in a constant state of tension, a Middle Eastern Cold War between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Israel, once the recipient of significant European aid, now the Europeans are starting to back away, and it's the United States, particularly under JFK, that's starting to fill in this gap. We're going to talk about them later. And now they're starting to receive significantly more assistance from the United States. chatter begins to emerge that Nasser, who now has significant assistance from the Soviet Union because of the Soviets' intervention, on behalf of Nasser, is going to once again deny access to Israel to the Suez Canal. What does Israel do? Israel preemptively attacks Egypt, okay? Hoping to push the Egyptian army away from the Suez Canal and possibly even take the Suez Canal and eliminate the threat of being denied the use of the Suez Canal. The problem is Egypt had a defense pact with Jordan and Syria. Therefore, if Israel attacks Egypt, guess what? Jordan and Syria are sucked into this war as well. And they had belonged to a unified country just a couple of years earlier, and it didn't work out, the United Arab Republic. So Nasser threatens to close the Straits of Tiran, which is a narrow body of water that leads to the Suez Canal, to all Israeli vessels. Egypt mobilizes forces along the Israel and Egyptian border. What happens? Israel preemptively launches a strike on the Egyptian Air Force, sucking in the Jordanians and the Syrians into this war. 6 days later, and the United States was giving some assistance, but was not involved. Okay? At the end of 6 days, they're given another defeat. Okay? They've been able to significantly expand. Israel takes the West Bank away from Jordan. Israel takes the Gaza Strip away from Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, and takes the Golan Heights away from Syria. If anything, this led to Israel more than doubling its size in the course of 6 days. In less than 20 years, the second humiliating defeat of the Arab nations surrounding Israel. So needless to say, this is a very tense environment, very tense situation to be living in. And just like anti-Semitism and gave birth to the Zionist movement, Jewish nationalism, the end result of European Jews coming into British Palestine and displacing the native Arab population would likely also lead to an opposing nationalism, to Palestinian nationalism, to the idea of a Palestinian identity, a Palestinian shared historical experience. And the father of Palestinian nationalism, Mr. Yasser Arafat, who the West considered a terrorist. Yasser Arafat was the head of multiple groups, the armed militia, armed groups that were dedicated to the idea of Palestinian liberation and, yes, the destruction of Israel. He was the leader of Fatah. In 1967, Fatah was absorbed into the Greater Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Yasser Arafat was the head of the PLO and would become the arch nemesis of Israel from that point forward. Him being the father of, the cause of Palestinian liberation. Since this is an American history class, let's talk about, how various American presidents, what's been their relationship with Israel. Like we mentioned earlier, Truman was torn between supporting Israel and what ramifications that could have with the rest of the Arab world. But at the end of the day, when Israel declared independence on May 14th, which was 2 days after the British mandate was lifted, 2 hours later, the United States recognizes the state of Israel. The United States is the first country to recognize the state of Israel. Um, During the Eisenhower administration, he intervened on the side of Egypt, strangely enough, siding with the USSR. I guess, solidifying America's neutral stance on this, not against Israel, but not wanting to antagonize the Muslim countries in the region. It's JFK. And by the way, under Truman and Eisenhower, the only aid that the U.S. sent to Israel was food and medicine. When we get to JFK, that's the birth of the U.S.-Israel military alliance. Um, he ends the Truman and Eisenhower era arms embargo. He's the first one to coin the idea of a special relationship existing between Israel and the United States. By 1961, there was 1.2 million Palestinian refugees living in refugee camps, many of them still living in these camps till today, be they in Egypt or Jordan or Syria or Lebanon. Because of this, nonetheless, what Eisenhower and Truman feared came to be. The Arab world started to see Israel as their existential rivals, and the United States, the supporter of Israel, despite the limited support at that time, and the ones that took advantage of this were the Soviets, and the Soviets began to support the Arab cause. And if that was a done deal, then the United States just went and outright supported the cause of Israel. This starts with JFK, okay? And JFK starts selling advanced weaponry to the state of Israel. By the time we get to Lyndon B. Johnson, our support of Israel is full support of Israel, but a cautious one since Jordan was still our ally. And it's during the LBJ administration, the Six-Day War happens. The United States our support was limited. We gave them F-1 Phantoms to Israel. And this would only cause many Arab states to start drifting towards the Soviets, Iraq, Egypt, etc., etc. So the last conflict to discuss here, and this is leading up to the 70s, the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Nasser's not around anymore. Now his successor, Anwar Sadat. This plays, the United States defeat in Vietnam, détente, a withdrawal, maybe not, the withdrawal of aid, the American economy kind of on decline. It looks like, maybe now is the moment that we could settle old scores with Israel, and the United States is not in the position to come to Israel's aid like it was before, and maybe this time we'll win. Okay? The Six-Day War was preemptively launched by the Israelis. The Yom Kippur War, that was launched by the Egyptians and the Syrians. This time they launch a preemptive strike against Israel. What do the Egyptians want? They want the Sinai back. Okay? So they attack Israel on the same day of Yom Kippur, which is a religious holiday. Simultaneously, the Egyptians hit with an attack in the south to take the Sinai Peninsula, and the Syrians hit in the north to take back the Golan Heights. U.S. comes in and supports Israel much more significantly than they had, during the 6 Years' War. And wouldn't you know it, the Soviet Union comes in and starts to fully support the Egyptians and Syrians. Why do you think Syria is still very much an ally of the Russians? And just because it's a fun fact or unfun fact, when we talk about the Soviets supporting the Arabs in this war, yes, it means everybody in the Eastern Bloc. Cuba sent 4,000 troops, okay, with helicopters and and armored vehicles to Syria to fight with the Syrians against the Israeli Defense Force. Um, the Israelis counter. The Arabs made great gains. This war doesn't last that long. It's from the 6th of October to 25th of October. The Arabs make gains in the beginning, and then the Israelis counterattack. The counterattack was so successful that the Israelis were almost marching on the very city of Suez to the south. They broke the Egyptian front, and they were shelling Damascus to the north. That means they were within artillery range of the Syrian capital. And the only thing that brought this war to an end was a UN brokered ceasefire on October 22nd, 1973. Okay? The Egyptians would fail in their attempt to recapture the Sinai. Israel would keep that. And Israel would keep the Golan Heights, which they have till this day. Okay. So there's a various, a couple of wars already since the inception of the birth of Israel, and we've been able to see how the U.S. support for Israel has actually grown over time. Now, what does this have to do with the United States and the 1970s? We're approaching the hour mark. Let's see if I could do this in 10 minutes, although it would not be doing this topic justice. The economic decline of the 1970s, not the only, but the chief cause behind it, okay? Well, the cause, inflation, okay? I shouldn't have said cause. The chief symptoms of this economic decline was inflation. One of the chief causes of the inflation was energy prices kept getting higher and higher and higher. Now, one of it was structural. Our consumption of energy, namely oil, was exceeding our ability to produce it. So much so that we had to import greater and greater amounts of oil from outside the United States, from countries that increasingly were antagonistic to the United States. Those oil exporting countries, okay, in order to protect themselves against market fluctuations, formed a cartel called OPEC, the Oil Producing Exporting Countries Cartel. They, as a cartel, would set the market price for oil. Okay? They decided to punish the United States for America's, this almost led to a nuclear war, by the way. Well, maybe that's an exaggeration, but it led to a tension between the Soviet Union and the United States because we're essentially fighting a proxy war in Israel. To punish the West for their support of Israel, they decided we're not going to export any more oil to the United States. We're going to teach them. If the supply of oil begins to shrink, that means the price is going to skyrocket. Skyrocketing oil prices affect all kinds of sectors in the economy, and they pass that cost off to the consumer, and prices are going to be driven up even more so. Okay, which leads to the oil embargo of 1973 to 1974. Okay, long lines of gas, and this is one of the chief antagonistic reasons. The chief reasons that antagonized the economic decline of the 1970s. Prices were high for a number of reasons, but prices became higher than they had to be because of the oil embargo, and there's two of them. Oil becomes scarce, it becomes expensive. Oil becomes expensive, it becomes expensive for business to continue to do business, and they pass that cost off to the consumer, as well as cut down on production, which means letting people go, which was another feature of the economic crisis of the 1970s. And as you can see, how many banks actually, you can stop the slide later on and read it, how many banks failed because of these two embargoes, 73 and 79. So I want to get to this. At least we could do this in the next 5 minutes. How did the United States solve this issue? And it's kind of a complicated answer, and it kind of goes all the way back to that secret meeting that FDR had with the king of Saudi Arabia in the middle of World War II. He says, hey, listen, if you stay on the Allies' side, let's make a deal. You promise to stay with the Allies and sell the Allies oil. We promise to buy that oil, okay? And to support you militarily. And so a relationship existed between the Saudi Arabians, which were, Saudi Arabia, which is one of the chief OPEC countries, and the United States. But then the Saudi Arabians, I guess pressured by other members of OPEC, went ahead and with the oil embargo. That gave birth to something called the petrodollar. Okay. Well, actually, the petrodollar is born after that meeting between FDR and the king of Saudi Arabia. Think about this. One of the things that FDR does is he pulls the gold standard. Before the Depression, and this is before the meeting with the king of Saudi Arabia, average Americans could take dollars and they could use it to buy stuff, or they could redeem it for gold. Right? The gold standard. The value of the dollar was pegged to the dollar and the gold, and the market value of gold. And then FDR pulls that, right? And then we fast forward to the Nixon years, right? And one of the ways that Nixon is trying to do, after the war, you have the Keynesian formula. In order to avoid another economic catastrophe, you have to do everything you can to keep people employed. The Keynesian formula was more people work, the more they produce. The more produce, the economy grows. All right? Therefore, do everything you can to make sure businesses have enough money on hand to keep people employed. That meant printing money. That meant banks lending money at very low interest rates. Okay? And before you know it, you have way more in circulation than the economy could handle. When there's too much of something out there, its value declines. A weak dollar, and ever since, too many weak dollars out there, what do people start doing? Holders of US dollars. Bretton Woods after World War II. Okay? When Bretton Woods was founded, it basically made the dollar a reserve currency. The dollar was pegged to gold, and everybody else's currencies were pegged to the dollars, and indirectly to gold as well. What does Nixon do? He takes the dollar off the gold standard, even when it comes to international trade, because in the context of international trade, at least gold was still seen as a universal currency. When Nixon shock takes the gold standard, disconnects the dollar from gold completely. What's going to determine the value of the dollar from now on? The demand for the dollar. The dollar is going to float. The market's going to determine the value of the dollar. Currencies didn't always float. Currencies were pegged by their governments, either to gold or to another country's currency. That's what determined their value. When Nixon does this, he says, okay, the dollar's going to float. And now that the dollar's disconnected from gold, all these other currencies that were pegged to the dollar are floating as well. So what Nixon did, he destroyed the Bretton Woods system that determined the value of currencies. So, okay, now I get it. The dollar's value is going to be, I can't redeem the dollar for gold anymore. Okay, it was depleting our gold reserves. Okay, so you can't redeem the dollar for gold anymore, number one. Number two, what's going to determine the value for the dollar? Well, demand for the dollar. Demand for a dollar. Why would anybody want to demand a dollar? Because you want to buy things that you buy in dollars, like American goods. But wait a minute, there was a deal that was made with the Saudis, and they agreed that, and to this day is true, all oil sales done on the open market are conducted in dollars. Every country, this is the petrodollar. Every country has to abide by this because this is an understanding, an agreement. Okay? You want dollars? You want to buy petroleum? You need to get dollars. So let's say Mexico wants to buy, although it doesn't need to, it has its own petroleum industry. Let's pick another one. Let's say, or I don't know, Japan wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia. Well, Japan needs to convert yen to dollars and then use those dollars to buy oil. This is interesting because you've just injected, What's going to determine the value of the dollar? Demand for the dollar. Who the hell wants to demand for dollar? Everybody that wants to buy oil, because oil is only sold in dollars. Therefore, everybody's trying to obtain dollars. Why? Mostly so they can buy oil, because oil is only sold in dollars. That almost artificial demand for the dollars, for something that the United States, until very recently, doesn't even produce, propped up the value of the dollar. Eventually gave the dollar more value, and eventually brought inflation under control. And how do you talk the Arabs into doing this? You tell them that it's in their own best interests. When they sell oil for dollars, they'll be able to accumulate dollars and do what with those dollars? Not only have an easier access to American goods and services, but they can buy bonds with those dollars. If the Saudis sell literally hundreds of billions of dollars worth of oil and they receive dollars in exchange, they can make even more money by putting these dollars in treasury bills that 5, 10, 15, 30 years later pay that amount of money back plus interest, as well as investing in the stock market. As the demand for oil increases, the demand for the dollar increases. As the demand for the dollar increases, it strengthens the dollar, gives the dollar more purchasing power, and average Americans enjoy a greater standard of living. All because of this arrangement that oil must only be be used for dollars. If you're a leader that wants to if you want to find yourself assassinated or deposed really easily, publicly suggest an alternative. Hugo Chavez at one time suggested accepting euros as well as dollars for Venezuela's oil. Hugo Chavez would die of cancer soon after. Saddam Hussein made a similar suggestion. Gone. Omar Gaddafi suggested the development of a gold-based currency, an African dinar, that he would accept in exchange for oil as well as the dollar. Gone. Because the foundation of our economy, of our prosperity, very much so, is solidified by the petrodollar. These dollars that are given their strength due to a demand for the dollar because they're rooted in the fact that open market sales of oils must be conducted in dollars. All right, so we're in 1 hour and 2 minutes. Hopefully that was interesting, and we are going to stop it here.